Okay, so this topic is somewhat sensitive in the autism community right now, and I wrote down what I want to say for the most part, and I'm most likely going to be reading off of it, but I wanted to be selective with what I mention and say to you all. Recently, I've been getting a lot of videos on my FYP and have looked into it a little bit more, research within the community that's on TikTok, and looking into the updates for the DSM-5. But there have been a lot of videos about this discussion surrounding the DSM-5 and its place when it comes to self-diagnosis. I'm gonna go ahead and also make sure to have links to Ricky's video as well as the person who goes under the username Sagittarius. But they both have really good videos kind of explaining, this discussion or kind of this argument that's happening around our community when it comes to the DSM-5 and whether, self-diagnosed people should use the DSM-5 to self-diagnose, and whether if they don't fall into those criteria, if they're autistic or not. So I'm just kind of summarizing some of the discussion that was mentioned in Sagittarius's video and a little bit in Ricky's. But when it comes to the DSM-5, it has been updated to be more inclusive and open to people of color and especially high masking autistic people. With both of the discussion and what I'm hearing is, and also the part that I mostly agree with, is that the real issue we should pay attention to when it comes to DSM-5 isn't the DSM-5 itself, but more the way that clinicians are using it to interpret and to diagnose people who are autistic. For example, the DSM-5 itself has these different categories that illustrate how a person exemplifies the traits and behaviors that are categorized to be autistic. And a lot of times though, the issue with clinicians that are not up to date with how they use the DSM-5, nor are they using the most updated DSM-5 or measurement and criteria to diagnose autistic people, but they're not inclusive to how they interpret or what examples they provide. And there have been many times within this autistic community that I'm part of in Facebook where I heard them experience going through the process of getting diagnosed, and the clinician literally said, you pretty much meet all the requirements, but I'm not going to diagnose you with autism because you gave me too much eye contact. That's kind of like the issue, is that the DSM-5, we need this criteria, we need these measurements in order to diagnose people. But what happens is clinicians kind of throw that out the window in order to not give somebody the result or the diagnosis of autism. The DSM-5, of course, with any kind of medical criteria will have flaws. It's up to those spaces to update and to listen to those who are being diagnosed or are part of these spaces to update those measurements, and they have. But no matter what, we still want and we still need in our community, no matter any kind of community, medical-wise and mental health-wise, need a way to classify who is autistic and who is not. If we don't have those measurements, if we don't have those criteria, y'all, then how can we keep that term, everyone is autistic, from actually being true? If we don't have categories to set us apart from neurotypical standards and other neurotypes, how will we be able to measure and actually come to a conclusion about who is and who isn't autistic? I just want to say that even though I believe self-diagnosis is valid, I started as a self-diagnosed autistic before I went into the process of getting a clinical, formal diagnosis. But I do agree with Ricky and some other autistic people and content creators when they say people should still meet all the criteria or the needed criteria to diagnose themselves to be autistic. But when it comes to misinformation, when it comes to overwhelming amounts of information that is out there about autism and the varying opinions that you see on TikTok, it is really confusing to know how to interpret all that. We have people saying self-diagnosis is valid and that we don't need the DSM-5 or professionals because they aren't trustworthy or not up to date. But then there are people who say that diagnosis is only valid when clinically diagnosed. But those same people who are saying that are also forgetting the inequities with healthcare accessibility, and therefore that is when self-diagnosis can be valid and is valid, especially for people of color who are autistic individuals. So don't get me wrong, TikTok is great to know more about the varying autistic individuals and the spectrum that it is. But we really have to avoid videos that give us things like, you might be autistic if, and then a presentation of 5 very generalized behaviors and habits that every human exhibits. Even in my own videos that I use that have that kind of similar format, I avoid using any kind of language that is using kind of this if, or trying to, in a sense, like potentially diagnose or potentially have people think they're autistic, because that's not what I'm going for. I want to include things that are lived experiences for me and other autistic people that I know have experienced the same thing. But if we only have, and those are the videos that get the most views and attention and are very relatable, if people only self-diagnose based off of videos or information that is very generalized and relatable human experiences into 5 examples, then people who aren't autistic might actually think themselves as autistic, or maybe want to diagnose themselves as autistic. When I first got into this app, my FYP was completely riddled with those types of videos, so much so that I had to input into filtering keywords, and I put autism into that because I wanted to avoid getting any kind of autism videos. It wasn't until I saw more creators like Sarah and Morgan and Neurotactical who actually spoke about being autistic that I wanted to see more videos on autism. You also might be asking yourself, isn't autism a spectrum? What if my autism is a different part of that spectrum that we don't see in other autistic people? Yes, autism is absolutely a spectrum, but it's a spectrum of how much support an autistic person needs: high support, medium support, low support, and the degree to which their disability disables them. But we still have to meet every part of that criteria that diagnoses us and deliberates us to be autistic and in the range of that spectrum. I think it's really important that we're having these discussions, arguments, whatever you want to call them. And I know it's a sensitive topic. And one thing I want to add that I'm really not hearing so far in these types of videos, though, is that even if you do not fit into all of the DSM-5 categories and are not autistic, you can still be a part of this community. If you're self-diagnosing yourself as autistic but not meeting all of the DSM-5 criteria, I know it's hurtful to hear that you're not autistic, but that is okay. It is okay not to be autistic. I think what you want to be asking yourself and what you want to think about is, what have you taken away from learning about autism and learning about how it might apply to yourself? Maybe what you've learned from the autistic community is that the importance of accommodating yourself, balancing out your spoons, advocating for yourself when you need help. You don't have to be autistic to do those things and to help other autistic people and our community. If anything, if you're a different neurotype or are neurotypical but love the autistic community, because we're pretty awesome, then you could still be a part of it but have the advantage of not being disabled and could potentially help support and help us as advocates for change. However, if you tell me if you're autistic, chances are I'm not going to question it. I think in most cases, those who do self-diagnose are the ones that have done the research outside of TikTok and most likely have seen how they fit into each of the DSM-5 categories. But we have to remember that autism is a disability. If we minimize that, we will minimize the need for more support services and accommodations for the individuals and families who rely on them and need them in our community.